Hi, hello. This is the disembodied voice of Bryan, and I want to let you all know that there are some audio issues with this episode, but I hope you still enjoy. Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of my podcast, episode 22. Something a little bit different for the next couple months. So for the remaining month of December and January, I kind of came up with this idea a little bit with discussions with, some of our previous guests, some of the work I do outside of this podcast. And I wanted to dive deeper into this idea of home is here. So this is what the series will be called. And so to kick us off a little bit, um, I have Allison Henry, a San Gabriel Valley resident, born and raised, a Pasadena resident for 14 years, and a field organizer for Everyone In, part of the United Way, and specifically the East San Gabriel Valley area. Um, she was a member of the Pasadena's Tenant Union and organized some COVID-19 relief, I believe. Um, the San Gabriel Valley Tenets Alliance, a founding member, and then the Monrovia Housing Group. And so, am I missing anything else there, Allison?
I hope not. Pretty busy.
Yeah, it's been very busy, and so this is a long list of things that you do. And what I wanted to try to do beginning podcast is this idea of um as we mentioned with Eric Sonata, um that there's right now we've if you've been living under a rock, we've been dealing with a pandemic, and as of recording right now, we don't necessarily have in sight another stimulus plan that helps renters. The eviction moratorium will be, as far as we know, will be expired in December 31st. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the way the eviction moratorium, if your renting unit or mortgage is back federally, you're not technically legally evicted from that property. And then we'll probably get into that a little bit more. And so that's going to be running out in December 31st. And then
Right, the federal protection.
the
Yes.
federal protections. So we're going to get deeper into what a tenant union does, what Everyone In and United Way helps in these communities. So primarily the San Gabriel Valley, but there's of course more people across the LA County area. But we're gonna probably be focusing in about the San Gabriel Valley area. But any more information, this is going to be a long podcast, I imagine. So
Okay.
am I missing anything? I think we're good. I don't know. So the first thing, so
I don't think so.
I don't think so, but
I
I think
don't
maybe
think
the
so.
first question would be, so what got you into the work of advocating for housing in this area, or like just the topic of housing? Well, how did you get involved with Everyone In?
Well, I was actually involved in housing before I was hired by Everyone In. I'd always been politically engaged, but it was usually like on the national and international level. I was not, before about 2016, I wasn't terribly invested in local politics. And then at the end of 2016, my neighbors and I here in Pasadena all received significant rent increases. So this was before the state rent cap. So at that time, my rent increased 25%, but all my neighbors, their rents increased between 55 and 60%. So of
Mm-hmm.
the 16 apartment units, it wound up actually turning over, I think, 13 of the units. And we lost all of the young kids who lived in the apartment complex. So I organized a few of my neighbors and we went to go see our city council person. And I thought we would get a sympathetic hearing from him. You know, we brought our rent increases. My
Mm-hmm.
neighbors had taken the afternoon off work. I'd taken the afternoon off work. And I have to say, it was my council members' reaction to us that really galvanized me. Um, And this is someone who, is seen as like a Democrat in our city, and he looked at our rent increases, and his first response was, "Oh, my tenants aren't paying enough." So that was his very first response,
Really?
like that. Yes. And then his second response was, "Well, if you all can afford these rent increases, why aren't you buying houses?" So, and then, for the next hour, he was pretty dismissive of the majority of us, for being tenants. If we can't afford the rent, maybe we should move. It was actually really awful. If I had known that he was going to respond that way, I wouldn't have organized what I organized, because it was very demoralizing to my neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that really did it, Bryan. That was really it. And so from then on, I was in pain in the rear to my city council, and I was already involved with the Pasadena Tenets Union at that time,
Mm-hmm.
and so it just got stronger. Then the rent control campaign picked up, and I played a big part in that. As a volunteer, here in Pasadena, I helped write the law, um, helped circulate the petition, organize the field efforts, did presentations. It was a real skeleton crew, and all grassroots. So yeah, that was it. And I saw the connection between housing and so many other things. And as a
Mm-hmm.
woman, also, as I started to talk with other tenants, specifically women, I realized that there's a culture of shame around housing. There's a culture of shame around not being wealthy, and there's a culture of shame around financial issues that actually puts you into a self-imposed bubble. You feel alienated, you feel ashamed, so you don't see your issues with rent or low wages
Mm-hmm.
as a larger issue, right? Um, it's your fault, and that's just not the case. So in doing this work, um, I've been moved by my fellow residents. I've been inspired by my fellow residents. I've been disappointed by my um, people in power.
Mm-hmm.
So last year, was I applied for this position with everyone in. It was my first paid organizing gig, and everyone in advocates for those who don't have homes, and to change and shift the narrative around homelessness, right? And that's just been it's been great to work in the San Gabriel Valley, because we've needed a lot of that work. But all of these things are really interconnected: the tenant struggle, the cost of housing, the increase in homelessness, and also this sort of weird issue our country has around like wealth and work and
Mm-hmm.
housing. And all of these things are being punctured by COVID-19, right? We're really asking a lot of deep societal questions around things because of COVID-19. And that includes stuff around housing, right?
Yeah. And what you mentioned earlier about your apartment and like the change in the population and the demographic, and you mentioned that a lot of kids had to move out of like that apartment. And what this does, and my work in the daytime is more like I'm in there kind of boots on the ground with the students, helping out with whatever they need. But I see them like really questions like, well, if I can't pay my rent here in this city where I want my education, I'm going to be forced to be moving from city to city. And like, what if they move to one city and then they'll have those same problems again? And then if they go to another city, and then if they move to another different state, then they'll still have those same problems. So do you think it's the work that you're doing with everyone in is like trying to say like, okay, well, it stops here. We want these individuals in these cities to stay here because they're the local community. This is the local economy. This is what um we need these people here because that provides funding for our schools, funding for our roads and things like that. And I think part of I might be doing one of my famous like rambling conversations, but one of the things that I've looked deeply into is this idea that developing without really a conscious effort to understand the needs of a community almost,
Well,
and
we could. I think I think in American culture we use the word like let's take what you've just described, right?
Hmm.
You've described people in their communities investing in their communities by way of their labor, their participation in the school district, members of the library, keeping parks populated, all these things, right? And so it sort of begs the question, like, you know, when we talk about market rate or the market, that's
Hmm.
not the same as a community.
Yeah.
That's like, and in fact, the market is fine with homelessness. The market is fine with breaking up communities because the market and the community are not the same. And when I hear that phrase, if you can't afford to live here, move. Um, Actually, I'll be honest, it fills me with rage. It
Yeah.
fills me with rage because it's dismissive, it's classist, and to be honest, it's usually said by people who've not had the housing struggle of this generation, because I think there's a racial implication here, class implication, and generational implication. Many of the people who stand in the way of housing being built, who stand in the way of shelters being built, who vote down things like rent control, those same people were able to buy a house on one income, avail of a fixed rate mortgage, and the recognition that stable housing produces a lot of other benefits. Why is that only the right of people who are actually technically renting their home from the bank until they outright purchase it?
Hmm.
Right? So I think we should really be asking these questions. And you bring up the school district piece. You know, what happened with my neighbors in Pasadena, that is why Pasadena school district enrollment is dropping. Pasadena's always struggled um, with its public school and the population sending their children to public school. These are holdovers of a racist past in Pasadena. Pasadena had to get a court order to integrate their schools. I don't think a lot of people realize that. So all of these things have like they have a long hand over the community. And then you get this like spike in housing. And in fact, members of the Tenets Union and we actually did a presentation to the city council. They were not interested and they should have been, but we've done the same presentation to the school board, the League of Women Voters, and everyone else.
Hmm.
And because I looked at what this was doing to the school district. And so I was able to chart a decline in enrollment in PUSD the same years we were seeing significant rent spikes, right? So, and what's interesting is it wasn't just the kids in the school district. It has a really pernicious effect on the school district being able to retain teachers and all of the necessary but lower paid folks that a school district needs. Um, you know, cooks in the kitchen, um, bus drivers, folks that are assistants that aren't certificated teachers. And the school district has a hard time retaining those folks or recruiting, because how far are you going to drive for a $15 or $18 an hour job, right?
Hmm.
Um, at some point, it's not going to be worth it. And I guess the last thing I'd say too, in terms of like what you brought up, that whole like, you can't afford to live here, get out. These housing costs are crushing the ability of generations of people to build any kind of wealth or cash or safety cushion.
Hmm.
And when we look at homelessness and the rise of seniors in that population, it's because you have a lot of seniors on, a very fixed income. And if they don't own their own homes, they are at the mercy of the rental market. And we all know that rents were really outpacing any kind of income, and that includes fixed income, right? Our Social Security benefits program. And I was speaking to an ally in Claremont who works at the Jocelyn Senior Center, and she was explaining to me that they have a lot, and this really made a lot of sense to me. And it wasn't a data point that I've heard LASA talk about, but my contact in Claremont told me that older women, senior women, really suffer because they they come from a generation where women didn't necessarily work outside the home. They would be stay-at-home wives, and because of that, they they get the bare minimum in benefits, and they're not able, and because they were married, they, in their benefit calculation, is their husband's income. So you have these women, right, who are like at a real disadvantage. I mean, it kind of trips me out. Like, it's like the first part of their lives was determined by sexism because they couldn't
Hmm.
work out of the home, or their options out of the home were very limited. And then like, and because of that, they don't have a lot of money. And I think housing is a gender issue too. I think you can't talk about gender parity if we don't allow women the right to have our own autonomy and ability to live on our own, to
Hmm.
live safely with dignity. And so when I think about all these senior women who, gave their lives to their families, their husbands, their children, they worked inside the home. Um, they're really stuck if they don't own their home when they go into their senior years,
Hmm.
and they wind up availing of food services and food supports. And that's actually where we get another picture of homelessness is, and we see it now, right, with COVID and all the folks lining up for the food banks. But even before that, when you would talk to people about like, what are our ways into seeing that we've got a social ill or that we've got a housing crisis? Because you don't always, like, the housing piece is, that information's imperfect. And one
Hmm.
other way is, when you look at the number of people availing of food assistance because they've paid all their money to rent and their housing costs, right?
Yeah, I think I remember when we were having a conversation about UBI with Chris Olson and the notion, like I brought up mayors for a guaranteed income, and Michael Tubbs, the mayor for Stockton, like
Stockton.
a lot of the data that where people just assume, oh, they're just gonna, this is like the most welfare queen and king sort of thing to do, just giving people money. Well, the data said like more than 60 or 70%, I need to double check this, more than 60 and 70% went to food, went to paying off bills, went to, just needs. They're not going out, like, I'm sure that some of that might be happening, sure, but more often than not, people are using it to pay off the necessities, food, rent, bills, all of those things. So this notion that we shouldn't help others at a time of need just kind of boggles my mind. And one of the biggest and the most imperfect things that I think I mentioned in our pre-interview is that, sure, this unemployment plus wasn't the most perfect response for COVID, but it was one of the biggest anti-poverty things that we've had. And like, I would preferred a monthly stimulus over it being tied to just homelessness. But this just recognized, if you put money in the hands of people, they know what to do, and then they can get and pay things off, and feed a family member, go out and pay off a bill, and all of these other things. And so I think,
Support small business,
and supporting small
right? Support
business,
small business, yeah, supporting their community.
restaurants, and yeah, the local plumbing store versus a Home Depot. And it's and this is another thing about cities that I just kind of don't get. Like, they're putting such a big emphasis on these big box stores for the tax revenues versus over the needs of a community that, you know then if you're going to do that, what's the point of the Chamber of Commerce for small businesses? What's And I'm not trying to be very dark or
No, but you're right.
pessimistic,
I
but
mean,
yeah.
no, no, no. But I mean, you raised that point, and it's interesting about universal basic income or any of these, like the way we talk about money, right? And so you look to the different schools of economics, which, to be quite honest with you, economics has not been very helpful in helping us work with social ills and money, right? We're better off
Hmm.
looking at like sociology as a discipline. But what's interesting to me about UBI is, on, like, for leftists and leftist economists, it's all about what the things you just said: social equity, um, a little bit of money goes a long way. It's an anti-poverty measure. But what trips me out is like, and you don't hear too much about this anymore because people have taken kind of a hard turn when it comes to business. But there was a time when you would read economists on the right, like Greg Mankiw, and he would talk about, one the like major tenet of right wing economics was that property and paying money into property was not a productive use of money. And
Mhm.
so that the argument that housing costs, high housing costs are detrimental to the rest of the economy, that narrative doesn't get pushed out anymore because it's all about the right to profit
Mhm.
with housing as your commodity. But when you think about, how productive a rent or mortgage payment is, it's actually not very productive to the greater society, right?
Mhm.
Your rent payment might be going to your landlord to expend, but it's not going into the community you're living. Um, and and it's not going to support all the things in the local economy. And yeah, I'm with you, Brian. Like I'm a little boggled as to like why why money going to individuals is not seen as a stimulus,
Mhm.
whereas money that goes to like major corporations who actually have a lot of cash on hand. I think about the support that the airline industry has gotten through this COVID panic,
Mhm.
or even some of the banks or some of these big organizations.
I
They're
think
getting so much money from the
recently,
federal government,
yeah,
and
I
it's
think
crazy.
I think recently, and this was reported by The Hill, like, we've had this kind of 6 months process since the first initial, CARES Act, providing that $1,200 dollar plus up for people and like that stimulus. We've been fighting for that ever since that first initial check. And then
I
if
know.
a defense company comes out saying, "Hey, we need a loan from the government where we need, something to help us get along this whole situation," and then the people at the very top of like the political food chain is like, "Oh yeah, like let's write that check off." And so it really kind of shows the
Right.
priorities and those people. And maybe it was worth it, maybe it wasn't, but the thing is, it shows a signal. It signals to your constituents that you prioritize these multi-million dollar companies over the individual, almost.
Yeah, and what's interesting is you didn't and you didn't even like play your hand strongly. And what I mean is, you know, between the money that's going out to major companies that arguably actually don't need it, this COVID stimulus, and then or all the money they were getting, and then the '08 bailout of the banks. I mean, I'm still uh, like at a loss to understand why there wasn't by April 1st there wasn't a discussion with major lending institutions and banks saying, you know what, we all need to hit a pause button because if
Mhm.
we don't hit a pause button, we're going to have people homeless. Now, the eviction moratoriums were very helpful for that, right? Because they kept tenants in their home, but it's not rent forgiveness,
Mhm.
right? After all this is over, one of the lasting legacies, right, of this economic and public health crisis are going to be like poverty, even more poverty, because people are on the hook for mortgages and rents that they can't pay now. I don't know how they're going to pay them.
Mhm.
The good thing is these debts can't be used to get people out of their housing, but it doesn't erase the debts.
Mhm.
Um, Leading up to the year 2000, I don't know if you remember this, Brian, but leading up to the year 2000, there was a lot of discussion about something called a jubilee, and
Mhm.
it was a jubilee for Africa. There was recognition in the international lending community that um, Africa, the continent of Africa, and all the nation states there had debts that prevented them from properly developing. Like, what we're talking about for individuals right now, like people are so saddled with debt, they can't they can't do anything else. They can't even make their own best life decisions. So
Mhm.
leading up to the year 2000, international governments started to talk about debt forgiveness and jubilee for the continent of Africa leading up to 2000. Unfortunately, it never happened. But the idea of debt forgiveness and jubilee is a very old idea. If you look back to ancient cultures, jubilees were done very often. When there was a new king or new monarch, old debts were forgiven. In some societies, it was every 7 years. In other societies, if there was like a major famine or other natural disaster, there was debt forgiveness. It was an erasing of the slate, And there's not been any of that type of talk. And when I think about how much money the banks have, and these investment groups, Blackstone, all these groups, they have a ton of money. They could do rent forgiveness. They could do Jubilee. I can't even, between like housing cost forgiveness and student loan or medical debt forgiveness, that talk about a
Mhm.
weight off of people's shoulders, and that weight would translate into a stimulus. Because people want to go out and spend in their local businesses. You can see it.
Yeah.
People are really trying to figure that out. Um, but they're limited by money. They're limited by money. And that's, the cancel rent, cancel mortgage movement is, we're really trying to push that forward, because otherwise people are going to be saddled with debt and homeless,
Yeah.
and that's just unacceptable.
And then to get back on track on this idea that home is here. So what, and we kind of mentioned this before, what are some common misconceptions about the unhoused and the homeless population? And I just have this notion that, like, I was looking up this Vice article, and it's like an old one. It's like around 2013, but they were talking about London and like this phenomenon where, they've fully gentrified the West End, and they've made it so that no one can afford in that area. And there was this biggest thing, controversy about a cereal shop selling cereal, a bowl of cereal for like $10. And this
Oh my
was like a
God.
biggest controversy in West London. And but it was a symptom of a bigger issue. It's like, well, so yeah, we had all of this gentrification happening. We have this phenomenon where 6 months out of the year, this place in London is a ghost town. Like when fall and winter comes around, it's nobody's there. And these are like rental properties. This could be like some rich person's second home or third home. And like, there's not a community there that lives and work and do things out there. And those people are somewhere.
Right.
They're not,
Right.
they don't just disappear.
Yeah.
And and these are, and when we think about homeless people, it's not just people making bad decisions and like and shaming them, and that in its other self, that you're just shaming them. You're not talking about the issues there. But the these are teachers, these are
Mm.
sometimes programmers, these are doctors at times, these are students trying to get an education, these are the police officers, your firefighters. These are community members that are being pushed off into the street, which they shouldn't have. Or at least as a community member, I don't think, if you go into college, get your master's degree, and you end up on the street, I feel like there's something wrong in that system. There's something wrong in that picture specifically, if that were to happen. And I was showing my dad one time, just I'm getting a little ranty, but this phenomenon in San Diego, you have master degree programmers
Mhm.
living in parking lots.
Yep.
One of the most developed nations in the world, one of many.
Yeah, so this whole, like, discussion about the myths of homelessness, right? So we have this idea that people are homeless because they can't stop drinking alcohol, or they have a
Mhm.
drug problem, or they're crazy, and that they lack the life skills to keep a home and a job. That is so untrue for the vast majority of unsheltered people out there. I can't even begin to tell you. Like, so I'll throw some stats out here for you and your listening public, right? So, um, the homeless count, point in time count done in January, most years, unfortunately, 2021 will not have a homeless count. That's a big problem. So in the 2020 point in time count, when LASA did all the stats and all that, we found some, and this even continued from 2019. So I would say a quarter of the folks that you see on the streets, living unhoused, a quarter of them would fall into that category of, substance abuse issues, uh, mental health struggles, um, those sorts of things. But the other three quarters, of folks are people who either had a medical issue or a rent increase they couldn't um, sustain, and that's actually how they wound up outside. Almost 60% of the first-time unsheltered folks are there because of a rent increase they couldn't absorb, loss of a job, or medical issue, and that's staggering. When I participated in the point in time count 2 years ago in Pasadena, what you described, people sleeping in their cars but working, that we don't even get an accurate count of that because the folks roll out of the parking lots before we're finished doing the counts, and they don't necessarily want to engage because they're ashamed. Right. And I agree with you, Bryan, like system failure. I can't even think of anything. Well, I can think of some things that are worse, but imagine being in a job that you don't like, um, and you don't have a home,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you have to go to that job and do the best you can after living in your car. So, homelessness happens to people because of other system failures. The other thing I would offer up is for that quarter of people that I described who are on the streets because of other like issues, sort of the more stereotypical things that we think about with our unsheltered folks. I even call BS on some of that, and here's what I mean. If you if you weren't an alcoholic or abusing drugs before you started living on the streets, that is going to be one way you are going to medicate.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting when people who live in houses struggle with alcohol or say opioids, we call it a crisis, right? It's seen as the health crisis that it is. Um, but yet when you're on the street, if if you have those problems, you don't get any sympathy. Those problems are seen as why you're in the situation you're in, which is actually not correct. Unsheltered people are the stats for them show high instances of violence. They are more likely to be a victim of a violence than the perpetrator of violence. They with encounters with police, they are also overrepresented in that bucket of folks who are victims of extreme police violence. And I think in America, like homelessness is this intersection of
Mm-hmm.
classism and racism because people see that, and especially for our our Black brothers and sisters are overrepresented in the unsheltered, right? Black folks are like 3% of the county's population, and yet they're almost a majority. I mean, not a majority, but they're like 30% of the homeless folks. And actually, you get the same correlating stats with the prisons too, which is really interesting. And I know that working in the San Gabriel Valley, one of the struggles in the San Gabriel Valley is it's suburbia.
Mm-hmm.
And so people think that in suburbia, you don't have homelessness, and that anytime you see anyone who's homeless, they're not even from the area. And all of that's just incorrect. And the opposition that we saw to Project Roomkey, the state project earlier in the year, right, to bring in COVID negative folks who are healthy but vulnerable into underutilized hotel rooms, that had opposition from both community members and unfortunately city council members of some of these cities, which
Yeah.
was insane to me because, they could have had tax revenue. But what I saw in this and listening to so many of the comments at city council meetings, you know, I could hear those racist comments because you could hear people say, I know that guy's not from here. We don't have a lot of Black residents, or
Mm-hmm.
most people here are housed. We don't have homeless people. And they're pernicious lies that actually prevent us from really handling the problem. And the last thing I'll say is, the mental health piece is real,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't think the answer is to forcibly lock up folks to cure them or to house them, right? And this idea that people are disposable if they're not our kind of people, um, that is not what makes a democracy thrive, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's an authoritarian, classist, racist. way of thinking that means that you can dispose of some people, whether it's our unsheltered folks who live out in the canyons and washes, who like even when they're trying to eke out a living in our natural environment, people still aren't satisfied and they want them gone. And what they really want is they want them dead. But you can't
Mhm.
say that. That's rude, right? But I
Yeah.
mean, it's, I'm sorry to like sound so like forceful about this, but this is really just a reflection of what I hear from people around, when they see folks on the street or when they participate in their city councils rejecting some of these housing solutions. It's
It's almost
obscene.
as if it's a very much as a human rights issue, and it's like not really getting that sort of attention that, like it's not a war, it's not a genocide, and so it's like
Right.
therefore like we don't pay attention to it, and as a community, like it's seen as a nuisance almost. And I don't.
I like that you brought that up, Bryan, like that
Yeah.
whole like that right, because I was talking with some neighbors recently, and and I always just am curious. I always look at like rentals, apartment rentals, to see what the rents are and all that, and there's been talk recently of the rents coming down, which is only true if you're moving to a new apartment, right? No one, I have yet to hear of a tenant whose rent has been lowered. If you're out there, hit me up at the San Gabriel Valley Tenets Alliance. I'm always
Hmm.
open to miracle stories, but I haven't heard that yet. Of rents being lowered. But what I do see when I look at these apartment listings now, Bryan, for a, I'll give you an example. For a 1695 apartment, so 1 bedroom in Pasadena, going for 1695, which is actually on the lower end of rent, right? For one person, if one person wants to move into that unit, they have to pull in $4,400 a month.
Hmm.
If me and my boyfriend wanted to move into that unit, we would have to demonstrate that we bring in $8,800 a month. That's over $105,000 a year. We would need to document, for two of us living there, that's what we'd need to document. I calculated that. And for one person, if I wanted to move in by myself, the annual salary is $52,800. But if hourly, like what that works out to hourly is $27.50. So basically, Bevan and Brock Management in Pasadena and all these other groups that do these same kind of scams where you have to demonstrate high income and high credit scores of between like 650 and 720, they're basically saying you don't deserve a home
Hmm.
if you make less than 27.50 an hour. And that
Yeah.
would be great if we were in an area that was paying $30 an hour minimum wage, but that
Right.
is just not the case,
Hmm.
right? And so what is that telling the rest of the community? So it is, I agree with you. It's a human rights issue. And I kind of see it as like a continuation of this drive to push people off land.
Yeah.
And when you look to the history of the United States and the founding of the West, that's exactly what went on. People were driven off land, murdered, or subjugated. And it looks a little different now. But when you say when you say to somebody you need to make $27.50 an hour to live in this city, I think that's a major human rights issue. A
Yeah.
major human rights issue.
Yeah, the reason why I contextualize it in that way is that I've been ever since George Floyd, I've been like diving more into Black philosophers, Black thinkers, and things like that. And Malcolm X
Good.
brings up a nice point. It's like the idea of civil rights is such an American notion, and
Mhm.
when you think about things in a global standpoint, or at least if we as the United States try to go in and help out, we call it a humanitarian right. If we're trying to help an area affected by genocide, we call it a human rights violation. Well, if Malcolm X is trying to bring more attention to Black struggle, why call it civil rights? It's a human right,
Right.
and when and the crazy thing is, and we mentioned this before, it's like housing is not a genocide, housing is not a war torn country, housing is not that. If it has to be shown as the most existential struggle for it to be something to get done.
Hmm.
And I think this is the frustrating thing, and like I said, I think I might be having my exceptional ranting moment, but like it almost seems is like like I'm so frustrated as like kind of like a public person trying to like help a community. It's like, why does an issue have to be so pushed so far into the center for anybody to care? And it's like it's this whole talk about the fight for 15, like
Mhm.
that was about ever since 2000 was this like, oh, like why are we going to try to make it federally this thing that everybody needs to have the same minimum wage and things like that. It's like, oh, this is the stepping stone for communism or something like that. But like it got to a
Mhm.
point when California voted in the fight for 15. Florida has just recently vote to pass to
Yes.
increase wages. So it's like it's weird. It's like it's shifted to the middle. Like, do you think those things are a little too late? And like I feel that there's a frustration as somebody that's been like kind of fighting and advocating. It's like, do we needed a pandemic for you to understand that this is an issue?
Well, the answer to that is yes. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, for such wealth, right? For such a wealthy country, America's very tight-fisted, right? It's very it's an unforgiving place if you fall on hard times,
Mm-hmm.
um, and we don't have any safety nets, um, proper safety nets. We have safety nets for people who actually don't need them, um, and it's. I mean, I know what you mean by like, is it too late? Like, were wages so low for so long that like bringing them like, yeah, like yay, $15 an hour. But like you and I both discussed, like $15 an hour now, like that would have been
Mm-hmm.
meaningful in 2000, right? That would have been meaningful. And now we're just trying to play not even catch up. People are just trying to backfill um, stuff. But yes, it did take a pandemic. But I think between the pandemic and quite frankly, Bryan, there's more generation of people in America struggling than not struggling. Like when
Mm-hmm.
you look at, ages and all that, like this is not acceptable. And we're starting to tip the cart, right? We're starting to
Mm-hmm.
tip the cart. I mean, I kind of, it's not a very nice question, but I've kind of posed this question to many communities. Like at some point, we're not going to be talking about organizing tenants anymore. We're going to be talking about organizing the homeless army because
Mm-hmm.
last year before COVID we had point in time count, which we all know is not an exhaustive count, but we were able to count 66,000 people in LA County who didn't have homes, and we know that there was already more than that before the pandemic, and now it's way worse. And I
Yeah.
just find myself asking, like, how are we going to have to start stepping over dead children? I mean, I don't mean that as like a facetious thing, but like, what will shock the conscience? Because obviously it's not been the homeless encampments. In fact, sometimes the homeless encampments inspire disgust instead of compassion and rage that should rage can be productive. Rage is not just the Molotov cocktail, especially for women. Actually, rage means that you've put your backbone up, that you're mad, and that you're going to fight back, right? And I just wonder, like, how many people need to live on the streets? How many people need to camp in doorways? How many people need to live in view of the freeway, um, on the side of the freeway, for people to get
Mm-hmm.
mad and to hold our leaders accountable? I mean, because the other thing is these sorts of specters. This is happening in a Democratic majority state. It's happening with people who we think of, who are aligned with a political party that we tend to think of, who try and create social policies so we don't have this.
Mm-hmm.
And right, and here we are in supposedly one of the bluest states in the country, and you know the rise of homelessness started here. But unfortunately, what you and I are talking about, happening in LA County or California, it's happening all over the country now and all over the world as tools of gentrification and speculation increase, and they have the buy-in and support of elected officials who are frequently involved with these developments, financial institutions, in a way that is conflict of interest. I mean, Dublin, Barcelona, um, you know, all these places around the world. Berlin. Berlin brought in a 5-year rent freeze, right?
Hmm.
So while it's happening all over the world, people are starting to fight back and push back. But it's definitely something to behold because people have to start asking critical questions. Why do we have people living on the street when we have like Airbnb and
Yeah.
VRBO and home from home, like all of these businesses that take housing stock and uses it as a hotel to
Yeah.
benefit very few people.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
remember one time when I had a friend from Australia coming by, and it's like this whole idea. It's like, oh, what happened to Airbnb in this area? It's like, do you want me to start a 1 hour conversation about what's been happening in LA? Like, this thing
Right.
has been a thing for years, and like you probably living in Adelaide and in Australia probably don't see it. You have family with generational wealth, you have all of these things. And so going back a little bit about and that is going into a conversation about how are we going to message this. We've talked about, we kind of speculated, we said, ideas like it has to be 100% like a craziest situation for it to be something in the minds of people that like should see this, our elected officials to see this, or like people in Congress to see this, people who of whom are our senators to see this as an issue. And I hate well, let me think about what I'm
I
gonna say.
would I, w- I
Yeah.
would say, like, as you're thinking about what you want to say, I would say that in the way the reason why we push for diversity in our elected officials is
Mhm.
to have people you know who look. It's funny, we used to think of it as, if someone looks like me, they've had my experience, therefore these folks who aren't in elected places, who look like me, they're going to get it. We just need to do that. That's one piece. We actually need to start looking at things like class and wealth too, right? um,
Mhm.
because again, that intersection, because it's great if we have female majorities and people in color in our elected offices, but if they come from the wealthiest echelons of society, they're not really representing the full lived experience of all constituents. And the
Yeah.
class, America doesn't like to talk about class, right? We think that everyone in America is either middle class or wealthy,
Yeah.
and class is for Britain, and
And
that's just not the case.
yeah, and there's been examples of, or late last year, early this year, that there was a big corruption case. Jose Weezar,
Oh
that
yeah.
was a part of the LA City Hall, and this was blatant corruption. A pay for play model for companies to come in and develop in his area, put up all of these apartments and strip malls and all of these things into his community because someone said, hey, I will give you X amount of dollars cash for me in front of the line to develop in your city or your part of LA, the LA City area. And and he, person of color, Democratic Party, you know and for, as citizens like you and me, it's like we should call that out, and say, that's not a good thing that you just did there. And hopefully, if there's anything that comes out of 2020, I think there might be a bigger emphasis on saying, hey, I voted you in, what are you doing for me lately?
Voters are getting angry, and what's great is, with this last election, there's obviously all the talk was at national level, and obviously a state level for us in California with the number of propositions. But when we look to the local elections, people were engaged. People
Mhm.
people were engaged, and in many of the cities in the San Gabriel Valley, we had record numbers of candidates running. There were more tenant candidates running in various races in the area. They weren't, unfortunately, all successful, but we had some great wins. Sasha Perez in Alhambra,
Mhm.
she was elected to the council and walked into the rotating mayorship, and she's a tenant, and she's already introducing tenant protections to the Alhambra City Council. we had we're close to a victory in South Pasadena to close the eviction loophole of AB 1482, and that's all citizen led, and getting folks elected to council who are aligned with the tenant majority of these cities. Baldwin Park, Emmanuel Estrada, a new mayor, he helped bring in. He was part of the community that brought in rent control. They didn't do it through a petition and a ballot. They brought Baldwin Park brought in rent control by pushing the city council, by the school district and the churches and the local community saying, we have had enough of being priced out, pushed out. We're pushing back, and they brought in a rent control, and it's tighter than the state's protection. It's 3%. 3% increase, like the city of Los Angeles. So I think about that and think, people ask, how do you get involved? We'll start getting involved at the city council level. It's
Yeah.
sometimes the unsexiest of politics. What you brought up with Jose Huizar in LA City. That's that's interesting stuff. But all this stuff around housing, a lot of it is on the local level, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of it's a way for politicians at the state level to actually kick the can down the road. The fact that we've had that it took so long for the statewide eviction moratorium to come up, that we haven't had any real meaningful protection for small landlords and tenants.
Mm-hmm.
It's unconscionable, and then we have to do it city by city. It really is. It's too bad, because it means the advocates have to work, but it also means that when communities start organizing within the community, and when they start connecting to other communities, we realize how strong we are. And then we can hold people to account and get some stuff done.
And it's like and I always talk about this phenomenon and this idea to both friends, and to some degree if students ask, I talk to this idea. You need to vote, and it doesn't matter midterm, it doesn't matter presidential. Whenever you get a ballot in the mail and they say, oh, you go election, it's like you have the ultimate power as a citizen to make those changes all across the board. Like, your local judge, like, oh, he put like 15 to a life sentence for somebody with marijuana possessions. Like, that doesn't sound right to me. And it plays more into this criminality, and like, feeds into the homeless population and all of these other things. What I mean? Like, you could do something about that judge, or the DA or the mayor that's like said, well, I don't care about the park, so therefore I'm gonna get rid of this. If that's something that you care about, and you say, well, like, these are our public spaces, you get that mayor out of there. You get that city council person out of that city. And so that's what I always try to say. It's like, it doesn't matter if it's a midterm or a presidential election, it's all important, and everybody should vote for all of those
Yes.
things.
And it's not just, and the other thing with the vote is it's not just one and done, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have to keep tabs on your city council, keep tabs on our state assembly and house, so that you can follow up, or when you see that they've made decisions that you don't like, submit public comment.
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you, Bryan, the thing I've learned in the last few years, being a local community organizer, it is amazing what you can do with if you organize folks and get them to submit comments or show up to city council or board of supervisor meetings.
Mm-hmm.
And even in these Zoom times, you can still muster a lot of public comment. For example, city of Pasadena last Monday night, their last city council meeting of the year. In fact, their last city council meeting until January 11th. On the agenda was a report about how there are no bad weather shelter
Mm-hmm.
in Pasadena this year. They're going to opt for motel vouchers. And a few of us organized folks to submit comment expressing outrage and saying, y'all need to do something because you're not meeting until January 11th. So we had over 50 comments submitted in 13 letters. And while we didn't get everything we wanted, that push added 2 hours to the city council meeting, an hour to read the comments, and then an hour for the city council to discuss something that they were not going to discuss. And at least they set up emergency powers so that should there be a greater need than they anticipated, the funding will be freed so they don't have to come back or we don't have to wait until January 11th. So I'd really urge your folks, if you're politically inclined, watch your city council meetings or your board of supervisor meetings, submitting comment and organizing people to show up, whether it's in person, on the phone, or Zoom, because each city council and body does them slightly differently.
Mm-hmm.
It's meaningful. It's meaningful, and it's a way to keep folks in check when we can't vote them out of office yet.
Yeah. And that's a good thing is that it's almost to a community. It's like they value their vacation more than thinking about the citizens in the community. And I think
Right.
this is also kind of playing out on a national stage with the whole stimulus thing, and that's going to be like another 2 hour conversation. But I don't think we're gonna end soon. But I did want to get more information about the idea of a tenants union and like all of these different community groups that are in the San Gabriel Valley area. And so I think maybe just straight to the first question. So, what does a tenants union or a tenants alliance do in a community?
So a tenants alliance or tenants union, a tenants group, whatever way, whatever verbiage you want to use, is really to inform and empower tenants, or empower and inform, whatever way you want to prioritize that. And it's to empower and inform tenants about the rights they have in
Mm-hmm.
terms of, staying in their unit, or what to do when they get paperwork or behavior from their landlords that's illegal. Um, but it's also to empower them as a member of the community. There are too many people in communities who think that the only people who have a right to participate are property owners, and that's an unfortunate holdover of a slavery society, right? Is that the only people who have power is those that own. Um, I mean, if you go along that, you're disempowering the majority of people in the state and in cities. So the hope for a tenant union or a tenant alliance is just that, to inform and empower the tenant residents, to grow collective power and awareness about the struggle, and to improve things so that it's less of a struggle. And that can include homeowners. The San Gabriel Valley Tenets Alliance that I founded, we have a number of members of the group who are not tenants, they are homeowners. And most of them are older women who realize that if they were my age or younger in this time, they would not be homeowners.
Mm-hmm.
And they kind of see, right, versions of their younger selves in their tenant residence. So we've got a number of folks in our group who are not tenants, but they are all about tenant empowerment and lifting up tenant struggle and lifting up information to get folks to stay in their homes. That's really the value of a tenant union, um, to create power and to create information.
Yeah.
And there are lots of tenants unions in the area, or coalitions. That's the other way you see it. So like Pomona, for example, their coalition is called PUSH, Pomona United for Stable Housing. Because when you think about the stakeholders in like stable housing in a community, it's not just tenants. It should be majority tenants, but children, the school district, a lot of community partners who have a stake in stable housing. Um, Burbank, when they tried to bring in their rent control measure, unfortunately, it was unsuccessful, but they did it through a tenants' rights committee. And all of these organizations, including San Gabriel Valley Tenants Alliance, we also push out Know Your Rights workshops. And that's really another key. That's the education part, right? The inform part. So like just in terms of a practical thing done in a community, tenants organizations typically will push out a Know Your Rights training, and then also ideally show up to create or push or advocate for better policy at city council or county board of supervisors.
Sorry, there's some kind of commotion outside. I think it might be
Yeah,
the
I hear that.
Rosemead's Santa thing where they're trying to spread a holiday cheer. Uh,
Holidays spread cheer without spreading COVID, huh?
yeah, yeah, and
Nice.
I think it might be the police, the fire departments are all involved, and I guess that's a Santa. Oh, that's fun. Anyway, so
Well, just to just just to close out the tenants union piece, I would say that one other sort of for those folks that maybe don't like they don't rent, they're homeowners. This is
Mhm.
all foreign to them. You know, the reason why they're hearing about housing at all now, you know, in federal news and state news is because of the years of work of tenants advocates. You know, 4 years ago, housing was nowhere in the federal discussion.
Right.
Even 2 years ago at the state level in local elections, homelessness is always an issue, right? But there wasn't even the connection being made between high housing costs and homelessness. So I would say, you know, a role or one thing that all these organizations do is lift this whole issue up in the same way that immigration advocates raised DACA and the overall, and gosh, even the horrible treatment of our immigrant brothers and sisters in detention, right? All of that was lifted up by immigrants advocates who finally got it on everyone's radar and dashboard. And
Yeah,
thank God
and
for it, right? So
yeah,
that's,
I
yeah.
yeah, thank you for that shout out. And I know by our conversations, like, there's a lot of doom and gloom, but that's just given the circumstances that we are living right now with COVID. But yeah, you're definitely right, 100%. There's been years and even decades, honestly, even going back to the civil rights movement of Dr. Martin Luther King and what his son is doing right now with this idea of like, how do we address poverty, and like not many people understand, and I guess this might be the whitewashing of civil rights movement. A lot of that was also a anti-poverty or a referendum on the US not really looking at the African American community and investing in those communities, saying that, we've done this wrong, and yes, it is a civil rights issue. We want our voting, but, you know, for decades, you made it impossible for us to generate generational wealth. You've had a situation like Black Wall Street, the in Tulsa. You've had
Yep.
that situation. You had Greensboro, and these areas where there people of color made wealth for themselves, and over again had that taken away, either both by shady financial dealings or by force. And so
Yeah.
this
Outright violence. Yep.
yeah, and so this is decades of work, and it's a good way to just shout out all the people that are doing these things. And so speaking of the work you do, and everyone in, so we've had a discussion in the pre-interview, like this idea of like so like everyone in has been this entity for how many years?
Everyone in actually started, I believe, 3 or 4 years ago, and it was the team was created to generate community support for projects funded by Measure H and Measure
Mhm.
Triple H. Yeah, so the teams or the campaign's been around for I can't remember if it's 3 years or 4 years, and I've um, been on it for about the last year.
And I hope I'm not stepping on any toes, but like in and you've mentioned that everyone in is going to be shifting a little base next year, and there's still going to be the piece on homelessness, how to um apply recommendations for cities, and get people to go advocate for, both on the tenants level, on a homeowners level. But you also and I think we've kind of really talked about this notion of education, this idea of demystifying what being unhoused mean, or what it means to be homeless or unhoused. And I remember one thing in the COVID times. We did a, I don't know if everyone in was part of it. I know it was an LA based religious Christian group, but they did a community tour. They invited individuals out to to view different examples of affordable housing and different ways that community members are using this as a way to address the homeless issue. So, did you want to talk a little bit about the what everyone in's plans for post COVID?
That's a good question. You know, a lot of this work is grant funded. So
Hmm.
as the grants are running out and ultimately changing, I don't know what this looks like on the other side in terms of how this is going to continue. I mean, everyone in's grown a huge base of advocates through LA County. When I look at all the folks who've added their names and said, text us or email us, keep us in the loop. Um, the campaign is going to be is has the base to continue moving on. I just don't know if it's going to shift more to like Measure J supported projects. I don't yet have visibility on what that's going to look like in 2021. Um, here we are at the 18th of December, right? But yeah, I
Yeah,
don't yet
yeah.
know what that's going to look like,
Yeah, I think
unfortunately.
that's kind of the burden of the the nonprofit industrial complex. The nature of our work that we do
Right,
is always very much dependent on who has the money to fund it, and then whoever has the money to fund it
right.
dictates the type of work we do. And so hopefully I'm hoping for the best, and I hope that the work that you do still continues, because I see all these like different workshops. We brought some of our students to a workshop and to talk the San Gabriel Valley issues. And I think I might close out with one last thing that's a little bit close to home for me. And we did talk about different issues in housing. We've mentioned, demystifying the myth of housing, and um, I might be calling out a few folks, but the Temple City had a blocking a plan in an unincorporated area. So there's so many layers to what had happened here, and I think I've primed it with Eric's podcast that an unincorporated area is could be like an in between city or another. It could be like an industrial area. It could
Mhm.
be a set of hotels that have different tax issues between two cities. So in this unincorporated spot between Rosemead and Temple City, I believe that the idea to turn a hotel from a hotel to affordable housing units. And Temple City had this mechanism within their city council to vote it down, galvanize their public, galvanize their citizenry to say, no, we're not going to have this so-called housing project in our neighborhood. And it wasn't even in their neighborhood. It was an unincorporated area of Temple City and Rosemead, and it got voted down. And this was way before my consciousness of housing, way before going on that trip to tour different types of housing um, models. Let's just say that different type of housing models. And so
Mhm.
um, I'm hoping post 2020, and I think we'll plan to get into that later, but hopefully more people are going to be advocating for, fairer housing, you know, things that don't require a market, like market needs versus the needs of people like you and me.
Right.
Sorry, I think I went
Well, I mean,
overboard.
this, but I mean, it's fascinating to me that, as we look at things like, if a place is going to be like a permanent supportive housing unit's going to go in, or like that affordable housing tour that you um, discussed. Yeah, Teresa Eilers with Everyone In organized that, and she did it with Making Housing and Community Happen. At
Hmm.
that time, I think they were called Greater Pasadena Affordable Housing Group, Jill Shook and Anthony Manousis. But it's interesting to me, Bryan, like in a lot of cities, it's like people have to ask permission to have housing there. It's like people who aren't wealthy have to ask the wealthy people in the city, can you please allow for housing to be built? And I think that's the one thing that I'm always disappointed at when I see folks who protest Project Room Key, um, who protest homeless shelters. Like, they're leaving their home, their four walls and ceiling and door and bed and comfortable furniture. Like, they leave all that to go outside, or to mentally go outside and stand against someone getting shelter. And I just think, how much more do you feel you can own?
Hmm.
How much further can your idea about, I own my house there, but I'm going to own everything else because I want to be highly selective about who comes into this community. Um, that that is the frustrating part of all this, right?
Hmm.
Like, and maybe this is going to be one other thing that COVID knocks down. That, and people are fighting back, like you said, that the community fought back against the fight back. I mean, we mobilized people to speak in support of Project Roomkey, and there were some communities that weren't welcoming and that were successful in getting this stuff knocked out. But a lot of times we were able to muster more supporters than haters, and
Yeah.
that always makes me feel good.
Yeah, and the thing that I've identified, and this is a citizen's idea of what has happened. There's no study, there's nothing peer reviewed, but this is a notion that I have, is that they're like they've have a mechanism to translate things into Chinese, and in Temple City you have a very predominantly Chinese speaking, Mandarin, Cantonese, Chuchao. So like you have this population that speak a language other than English, and then you have a campaign that's so targeted to Chinese speaking community members, and that outnumber more than the homeless population. And so hopefully, I've talked about this with the organization that that I've worked with, and like this idea of like how can we translate this material, because like we're doing good work, but it's always revolving around English and Spanish, and those things are
Yep.
important too. But we're leaving out a giant population that speak Mandarin, speaks Cantonese, speak Vietnamese, speak Khmer. They speak a language other than English and Spanish. And like, of course, the history of California, Spanish and English, but you have so many people immigrating from immigration doesn't stop, like this idea that it stops with the border and it stops with
Right.
ICE. It's like, no, people are still coming in and out. You're having a newer population of people in like the Middle East and northern African sections of the world, and you have the new Asian population coming from Myanmar and the Thai area. There's a lot of religious persecution against Muslim individuals, and so you're
Mhm.
having these new immigrants coming in, and like unless they speak the language, they're gonna be taken advantage of.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And it's not just the language. I mean, it's the language, like, it's the words and the phrases, but also, every place, every culture has what we call a social script. Those
Mhm.
things that you do, you know, in society, or not, as the case may be with COVID. But um, like, for example, I lived in Ireland for a few years, and so I speak English, and it's not a big deal. But there were certain situations, Brian, where, because I wasn't from Ireland, I knew as soon as I walked into those situations, it was very obvious to everybody that I
Mhm.
wasn't from Ireland, because I didn't do these social scripts properly. And it's those sorts of things that, right, that actually make or break whether people are going to integrate or feel they want to integrate into the culture. And on
Mhm.
the culture side, like, how welcoming they're going to be to folks who are obviously not from here, but very much belong here and are welcomed here.
Mhm.
um, yeah, and what you said about sort of the demographics, I'm really glad you lifted that, because the engagement into, the other non-English speaking communities is really key. There are class issues even within the various Chinese language communities, right? Folks who've been here a little bit longer, um, who are immigrants, tend to be less wealthy than recent immigrants, and so there are just a lot of things, you know this demographic isn't a monolith.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to be aware of that to really want to communicate. When I think about the communities that aren't being outreached to, right, our various Chinese languages, Korean, Armenian. I mean, there are a lot of very large communities that we need to bring into this work, because we might have to like take apart some of their cultural uh, baggage or beliefs that are brought to bear that aren't productive in this whole explanation of homelessness. Because I will say, as an immigrant, I mean, my parents are immigrants, and looking at various immigrant culture, I always find it fascinating to see how poverty, like America has poverty, what how is that interpreted or thought of by the variety of immigrants we get to the United States, right? Because I've heard it articulated as, Americans are lazy and that's why there's poverty, which we know that's not the case. um, and it's sort of an interesting sort of collision point of prejudice, and I mean, like, we all have prejudice, and so like everyone's prejudice gets exposed, and also you sort of see like, oh yeah, America's not the only place that has anti-poverty
Yeah,
prejudice,
yeah.
or anti-black prejudice, or anti, fill in the blank prejudice. So it does open, I think, actually a discussion that's very productive, because we need to be building bridges with all of our communities to really deal with and work with these economic and social ills.
Yeah, and you bring a good point with the language and and the cultural and social background, is that you can have these situations where like a family can own a home, but there could be multiple families in one unit. And how do you count that? Do you count that as well, are these two other families that's living in this property, are they homeless, or are they just unhoused? Because there's only so much that one unit in an area can provide, you know like how, like, space for like a family of three, and times that by two, like living in one apartment unit, or several families living in one home, or multiple compound areas. So like, and these communities, they're not be willing to talk about homelessness, and like a taboo, and it's like it doesn't give you, like you said earlier, there's not a accurate count of and data of homelessness in not just LA, but like throughout the United States. Homeless issues are going to be with us, whether we like it or not, for probably the next decade, unless
Mhm.
unless something like finding a vaccine in less than a year sort of situation happens, where we actually say, okay, enough is enough, to do something about it, right?
Right,
Unless that happens,
right.
this is going to be with us for the next decade. And so I think my last question, though, and I think I mentioned this with a lot of the individuals that do a lot of public work and do a lot of advocacy work. What do you see, in the next decade, beyond 10 years? What is your hopes, and what are some of your fears that you see in the next decade? And I'm not just saying, just because we have a democratic leader equals this euphoric change and everything. It's like, I don't even believe in that. And so
Right.
what do you believe is your optimism, giving it's 2020 and it's a new decade, moving forward, and what are some of your fears?
So I'll start with my fears, right? Because it's funny, when I used to be a teacher, I'd always start with the positives and then go to the negatives with my students. But in this scenario, I think we'll start with the negatives first. I mean, my real fear is that we're going to have a massive, not only a massive spate of homelessness with, the evictions coming, people having, um, debt. um, I'm worried about homelessness becoming the norm. I'm worried that we will be comfortable with empty buildings and full streets. I'm that those are my I'm fearful that we will become like some of the worst poverty stricken places in the globe, with hungry and starving children on our streets. I kind of feel like I see a specter of Charles Dickens' Victorian England in some of this, right? Um, and I worry about how much more powerful wealthy people become. I don't fear poor people. I fear wealthy people who are okay with winners and losers when you talk about things like housing and food security.
Mm-hmm.
That frightens me very much. And I worry that we actually might get to a time of severe civil unrest because people are desperate. Um, and that the heavy hand of authoritarianism comes down in the form of continued police brutality and all that. But what gives me hope, what gives me a lot of hope, is that I mean, you can't make this number of people in your society poor and housing precarious and not think that people are going to accept it, right? And that's
Mm-hmm.
actually what gives me hope. People fighting back. I would like to see more women in the tenants movement. I think the tenants movement is still very male. Um, but I think seeing more women empowered to make decisions around housing um, and maintaining a community, that's only going to get better. And I think people are starting to question the thing, like certain foundations that I think were incorrect. Housing is a business. That's a terrible model, right? That's a
Mm-hmm.
terrible model. People are questioning that. We're going to see the return of public housing. There are lots of things we need to do in the meantime to, you know, get that happening, not just funding, but we actually have to make some changes in the California state constitution to allow for, public housing to be built in single family neighborhoods. But I'm hopeful that people are wanting to look to other mechanisms for housing and to house everybody. That gives me a lot of hope. And to be honest, the internal discussions right now in the Democratic Party are also giving me hope. The fact that there's a call by, AOC to pull the, to basically get rid of the old guard in the Democratic Party. Because to be honest with you, who I fault the housing crisis, it's not George W. Bush or Donald Trump or any of those guys. It's people like Gavin Newsom. It's people like all of our Chris Holden and Anthony Portantino, all of our local male, legislators, many of whom are landlords. That's who I blame. And I'm eager and welcoming for a discussion to check those people's power and privilege because they're crushing the rest of us. And honestly, I think women and people of color have really we've had the short shrift for so long, and with housing, that's really where you see it, and that's really where you see the difference between people within the Democratic Party. When I was getting the rent control petition signed here in Pasadena, one of the worst encounters I had were with people going into Vroman's bookstore who were very liberal. They thought of themselves as progressive, but when it came to housing, not at all. Not at all.
Yeah.
They still very much believed an outdated um, meta narrative that's incorrect. You know, um, and one thing I would offer up in terms of the other things that give me hope, we've created a lot of mutual aid for tenants in terms of information sharing and eviction defense, and even like literal like eviction blockade. So I tell anyone out there who's a tenant who's struggling, um, if you're struggling, go to stayhousedla.org, stayhousedla.org. You can get information on your rights and resources. Also, look up if your area has a tenants union or a tenants alliance. You can find the San Gabriel Valley Tenets Alliance on Facebook. Reach out. These mutual aid networks and these organizational networks give me a great deal of hope, Bryan, because it,
Mm-hmm.
it means not only like we're mad as hell, we're not going to take it anymore. We're going to create our own communities and infrastructure to to try and keep the fight going.
Thank you. So I hope that we could see each other again on a different podcast, or even whenever we cross paths, hopefully after the restrict gets lit, and maybe do a live podcast in person.
That'd
Until
be great.
then, Thank you for agreeing to do a podcast. I think I learned a lot. I hope my audience learned a lot. And please check out everyone in some of the give me a quick second. Sorry, my
And
iPad
I would
just
also, as you're doing that, I'd
Mhm.
ask your listening public, call your state senators and House members to get AB 15 and AB 16 passed in early 2021. That is an extension of the statewide eviction moratorium, as
Mhm.
well as pushing for supports and assistance to tenants and small landlords, which
Mhm.
is, I believe, AB 15. But yes, push your folks to write in or call our House and Senate members of the state of California. Please pass AB 15 and 16. Keep
Yeah,
tenants in their homes.
and check out the San Gabriel Tenets Alliance, the Pasadena Tenets Union, Monrovia Housing Group, that you've been involved with, and I'm sure that we probably need another part two because I think there's stuff that's either in our notes that we haven't brought up, and like the work continues beyond a pandemic like this, and I'm hoping for the best. So thank you, audience. If you like what we do here, please like and subscribe, and we'll check us out on another podcast. And please stick around for December and January, where many of the podcasts will be on the subject of how home is here. And so that could be what today was, housing. It could also be about immigration. It could also be about drug enforcement and all of those things that push people out of their homes. And that I think this is not an exhaustive conversation, but I hope this really, really brought some of the issues in your community. So thank you. All right.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate the form and space, and thanks to your listeners.
All right. Bye.